Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on being Black abroad. My name is Trixie Cordova, and I'm the Associate Director of Student Services here at Diversity Abroad. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's webinar in honor of Black History Month. Before we officially begin, I do want to cover a few housekeeping items so that everyone joining us for the first time knows how to take advantage of the GoToWebinar platform. So this webinar is being recorded. So if for any reason you missed something or you have to step out for a few minutes, you will get a recording available after we wrap up today's webinar live. And it's also a somewhat interactive tool as well. So you'll notice next to your name, there should be a hand icon on the GoToWebinar platform. You are able to virtually raise your hand. So during today's webinar, as we pose questions, you're welcome to raise your hand if you feel like something might apply to you. And you can also type in questions into the chat box. So those questions will come to me, and I'll make sure to communicate those questions to our panelists later today, should they be directed at any one of our featured speakers. And we'll also have a copy of the slides that we'll share with everybody after today's webinar as well. So if you wanted to go back and click on any of the information we're providing, you are certainly welcome to do that. So with that said, let's get started. So here's a look at the agenda for today's webinar. I'll introduce, I'll introduce myself and my co-presenter, Laurel, who's the student fellow here at Diversity Abroad. I'll give a little bit of context about our organization for those of you who might be new to Diversity Abroad, resources or information and tuning in for the first time. And then we'll go into a little bit about who traditionally accesses study abroad and why is it so important for us to discuss the importance of seeing more representation of students from diverse backgrounds, and particularly students that identify as Black or of the Black diaspora. And then Laurel will take it from there. She'll talk a little bit more about managing identity before we then jump to expectations by country. And we're excited to have two students join us for that portion of today's presentation to tell you more about their experiences while abroad. Finally, we'll close out to talk about what it means to be the first person, perhaps in your family, to go overseas, or perhaps even be on a plane. It's definitely a lot of new information, and we just want to make sure that you recognize that Diversity Abroad is a resource for you, as well as other places you can find support through your own communities, on campus, at home, or even across your peers. And then, of course, we'll close out with some questions. So with that, again, I'm Trixie. I'm the Associate Director of Student Services. I studied abroad in the summer after my junior year of college, and I went to Italy, and it was life-changing for me, of course. It was the first time I traveled overseas, and my family hadn't ever really studied abroad before, so it was totally new and foreign, but of course changed my life and is the reason why I'm doing the work I am today. After I studied abroad, I have also been fortunate to teach English. So I was in rural Japan for 2 years after college. I've interned abroad, and then I got my master's degree in international education. So when it comes to having global experiences and knowing how kind of daunting but transformative that experience can be, I definitely speak from a place of experience, and I am looking forward to hearing more about some of the questions you might have about the global experience. But I also want to give some opportunity for my colleague, Laurel, to introduce herself to you as our co-presenter today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laurel. In my day job, I work at the University of North Carolina with Moorhead Kane Scholars as an advisor. So I actually work with students, many of whom go abroad over the summer or who do study abroad. Personally and professionally, I have loved traveling abroad, and it's been a huge growth experience for me. I was pretty nervous initially to do my study abroad. I went to the University of Botswana, but once I did, I couldn't travel to the next place fast enough. So I'm very excited to talk to you all a little bit more today about some of the things you can expect and to share experiences and answer any questions you may have. So thank you, Trixie.
Thanks, Laurel. So before we officially begin our webinar, I did want to put up a quick poll question, and I just want to gauge who's in the audience. So on this poll question, if you can take just a few minutes, I'll put it up for 1 minute. Please let us know if you have studied abroad before, or you've been abroad for a study or internship of some sort. Maybe you also have never been on a plane, or you've gone to visit family in the Caribbean, but that wasn't really a study abroad, right? So you might be option 2. And then finally, we want to see if we have any educators or parents also in the room as well. This is more just a question for us to see who's listening today. So I'll put up the poll for another 20 seconds or so, just so we get a couple more seconds of feedback. And then I'll make sure that we move forward. Okay. Looks like everyone has responded. Excellent. Okay, thank you all so much. So it looks like the majority of students have studied abroad. We also have a couple of people that are not students, and that's totally great as well. We're welcome to have you. We're excited to have you. And then a few students who have no study abroad experience. So this just helps us to recognize who's in the room and how we frame our conversation today. But thank you all for taking the time to do that quick poll. All right, so let's get started. So can you all raise your hand virtually if you have heard of Diversity Abroad before today? Like, you've heard of our organization, you're familiar with us, go ahead and raise your hand. If you're like, this is my first thing, just feel free to not click anything. Any hands? Okay. So it looks like we have an audience of mostly new to Diversity Abroad folks. So welcome again, and thank you for being here. So Diversity Abroad is an organization that started in 2006. You can go ahead and put your hands down, by the way. And it really started as a student resource website, and it still exists. So you can go to diversityabroad.com and you can check out the articles we've written, read more about the scholarships we provide, and get some general tips and resources about how to navigate the study abroad process. So it sounds like, of course, the majority of students listening have been abroad, which is great. But if you have any friends or peers who just don't really know where to start that process or how, we have a ton of information available for free on our student website. But really, the goal of our organization has evolved and grown since then. And we just really have a vision of seeing more young people from diverse backgrounds being able to achieve success in this global marketplace. So as the world continues to kind of grow and intersect, and being able to share information more quickly around the world with the internet, it's so valuable to have the kinds of skills that you acquire from having global experiences. And it really puts you in a position to take advantage of opportunities that might not otherwise present itself had you not had global experiences. And so let's talk a little bit about who is traditionally accessing global experiences and who isn't, right? So if you can see this chart, what we want you all to know is that this chart, this red, represents the percentage of college undergrads who are not studying abroad. So that blue box represents those of you who have voted that, yes, you have had some kind of study abroad or global education experience. So it's a very, very small percentage, right? And if you can guess, feel free, before we jump to the next slide, feel free to type in what percentage of U.S. study abroad students do you think identify as Black or African American? I'm just curious. So feel free to take a few minutes to type in your answers. 5%, 16%, 8%, 1%. All right, all relatively low, 2%, and pretty close to the truth. So we'll go ahead and show you on the next slide. It might be a little bit small, but hopefully you can see it. So Black students make up that little blue sliver. So it's a little under 6%. So a little less than 6% of the percentage of students that are studying abroad across the United States. So that means really a fraction of a fraction. We're looking at about 6% of overall college students that study abroad, and the percentage of students that study abroad in the US is about 10% nationally. So it's a very, very small number of students who are really represented in study abroad. And obviously, our work at Diversity Abroad is to try and challenge that narrative, right? Not a lot of students are accessing this opportunity. And for a variety of reasons, I'm sure many of you have heard or yourselves identify with in terms of personal barriers for financially, where your obligations to family and work. And so it's not uncommon, but we do want to make sure that students are aware that this opportunity exists, and that there are ways to take advantage of it despite some of those barriers. So let's look at this quote from former First Lady Michelle Obama, where in a speech championing study abroad for minority students, she says, "The only way forward, only way to solve global problems is to be working together. That's why it's so important for more of our young people to live and study in each other's countries. That's how, student by student, we develop that habit of cooperation, that by immersing yourself in someone else's culture, by sharing your stories and letting them share theirs, by taking the time to pass the stereotypes and misperceptions that too often divide us." So we wanted to share this quote with everybody because we really wanted to emphasize how important global experiences are, because they allow you to share your story with the world and to be exposed to the lives of other people. And so if the world is only interacting with a majority of students that reflect a particular identity, study a particular field, have a certain level of politics, they're getting a very skewed perception of what Americans really look like and where they come from and what they believe. And so I know earlier I mentioned that I'd studied abroad, that I taught English in Japan. And Japanese students very easily just thought, my favorite sport was baseball. And I ate hot dogs and hamburgers every single day. And I didn't know what sushi was. And so there are stereotypes like that that persist around the world. And so what we really want is for you each to become your own cultural ambassadors for however it is that you identify, to help challenge those stereotypes. And so being able to study abroad really does give you the opportunity to grow personally and professionally, to exchange in intercultural learning with others from different cultures and religions and languages, and to really set yourself apart when you're looking for to apply for jobs or graduate school or whatever might follow you after your undergraduate career wraps up. So with that, I want to go ahead and pass it to my colleague Laurel, who's going to talk more specifically about how to manage your identity and the perceptions and perspectives you might have while you're abroad.
Thanks, Trixie. So as Trixie mentioned, what you look like, where you come from, what you believe, these are all parts of your identity, right? And when you go abroad, these are things that you may have to rethink, things that you may redefine, things that may be challenged. So let's talk a little bit more about identity and how it's going to play into your experience abroad. Okay, so let's just do a really quick activity. And this is just meant to be whatever comes to your mind. If you can, and you feel comfortable sharing, type in the chat box the first 3 things that you think of that define who you are. What informs how you see the world? How do you define yourself?
And I'll make sure to read aloud any of those as they come in. And I won't say who's typing it in. I'll just write some things in. So Black woman immigrant, Black woman optimist, first gen Latinx gay, contributors, Jew, man, gay, African American, woman, fighter. It's all great.
I love that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll let you know as more come in.
Well, thanks everybody for sharing who did. And so what's funny is the first things that we share that come to mind for most people are race, right? That was a big one. Gender or sex, sexual orientation. For some people, religion may come to mind, other things that have to do with your beliefs and ways that you identify. One that didn't come up here was nationality, right? No one who typed in here said American or a person from the United States, which is interesting because what you may find when you go abroad is that although your Americanness doesn't define you at home, when you are abroad, it really does come into play. So historically and in the present day, many African Americans, we have complicated feelings about our relationship to America. And so abroad, it may be challenging and honestly kind of confusing to find yourself identifying and confronting your Americanness. And so this could take a couple forms. So maybe you notice the values that you have taken as just defaults, like the ones that I have displayed here. So things like free speech, independence, equality, being direct, being able to be informal with people, and individuality. So those things that maybe you just take for granted here may look different and are different than cultural norms in your host country. And so not only will you have to adjust to new cultural norms, you may also find yourself in the position of defending America or defending an American culture, which some people have a complicated relationship, right? You may feel strange defending something that you are also critiquing. And sometimes it can be difficult to recognize your own culture or customs until you are confronted with a difference in another cultural context. The funny thing is, despite perhaps feeling more American when you're abroad, others abroad may question the fact that you're American. So one of the most common questions that a lot of minorities get when they go abroad is, where are you really from? So you may find that your identity is questioned by others who think that you don't, and I'm doing air quotes, but obviously you can't see me, that you don't look American. In some places, there's an assumption that all Americans are white, right? And that if you are a Black person or a person of color, that you aren't a real American somehow. And I share this not to scare you or turn you off from going abroad. Most times, and many times, hopefully you'll find that these questions are based on ignorance rather than prejudice. Depending on where you travel, you may literally be the first Black person that some people ever meet, right? And in the next section, we'll actually hear from a few students who have returned from study abroad about perceptions and other questions that they've encountered during their time. So in addition to reconsidering identity, shifting privilege is another concept that you may encounter during your study abroad experience. So the first type of privilege I want to talk about is economic privilege. And obviously it depends on where you're traveling, but even if you don't consider yourself to be economically privileged at home, you may be considered wealthy by that country's standards. So for example, I studied abroad in Botswana, and the average yearly salary there is about $8,600 after taxes, right? So a vast difference in how far money goes and what is considered economically privileged. And secondly, regardless of your socioeconomic status, you do have certain other privileges that many of the people that you will encounter abroad don't have, right? So the first one is the privilege of getting a higher education, right? That's a privilege in this country as well. And the privilege of being able to travel to a foreign country in furtherance of this education. For some people, it can be jarring and maybe make you feel guilty to study abroad with this privilege. And these feelings are totally normal and understandable. And these are things that are good to keep in mind before you go, to reflect on while you're abroad. And often your school will have resources at the study abroad office or other campus resources that can help you navigate these issues. And we are certainly here at Diversity Abroad happy to engage with those and help you with that as well. And we'll share some resources at the end of this talk. And so the perception and treatment of you as a Black or African American student studying abroad is going to vary country by country, obviously. And we have some special guests today who are going to share their experiences in different study abroad countries and contexts and environments. So Nasser has joined us today to talk about her experience in a predominantly Black country. And I will let her introduce herself and take it away.
Hi. My name is Nasser Farah. As you can see, I go to Kenyon College, which is located in Ohio. It's a small liberal arts college in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And I'm a senior international studies major with a concentration in development studies. And I studied abroad last spring of 2017, at the University of Botswana in Gaborone, Botswana. So yeah, a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. So in the city that I was in, and in Botswana in general. So the demographics is, it was a majority Black country. It's located in Southern Africa. So I knew that coming in, that I was going to a country that everyone there, most of everyone there was going to look like me. And that was one of the reasons why I chose to study abroad in sub-Saharan Africa specifically. So some demographics about the country. It's like a country of about 2 million people, and they speak the language Setswana. And so when I first arrived, I didn't know how I was going to be perceived, or just what people's perceptions of me would be. Coming in, I'm Black, but I'm also Muslim. I'm a Muslim woman who wears the hijab. And you can see my picture. I have it up in a turban, which I wore it that way most of the time because it was really hot. But sometimes I did wear it down. So I just had a lot of questions about that, how I would be perceived and how people would look at me and assume where I was from or where I originated from. So a lot of the questions that I did get were people would ask me where I was from. And then when I would answer that I was a student from America, I would get that same question we were talking about earlier of where are you really from? And I know me personally, some of my background is that I'm Somali American. So I did technically have an answer to that of like me being like, okay, well, my family came to the US from Somalia. So I think that's the answer you're looking for. But sometimes I would just stop it at that. I would say, I'm American, and that was it, because I just wanted people to know that there were Black Americans that didn't necessarily have an answer to that question. And I had a friend on my program, her name was Jada, and she also was from my school, and she's Black American as well. And she would get that question as well. And a lot of people would assume, they would ask her, oh, are you from Kenya? Are you from Ghana? Or just assume different countries. And she would just be like, I'm from Chicago. And that's it. So yeah, and that was one of the things that surprised me the most, was that I was still receiving that question of where are you really from, because it's a question I get here in the US. So I wasn't expecting that. Another thing that surprised me was that in the very beginning, during our orientation, both Jada and I, we had within our program about only 13 students, all American. No, everyone was American except for one other girl. She was from Vietnam, but she's a Vietnamese international student at her university. And we all went to schools within the Midwest. So we all came from like similar schools. And like, it was a drastic difference to us because my school only has about like 1,600 students. And the university we were studying at had 16,000, like close to 16,000. So that was another big change for all of us, because they came from similar backgrounds for their schools. But during our orientation, we were all sitting there just speaking with each other. And we had this woman who she was an American woman, but she was like working for our program in Botswana. And on that very first day, she pointed out me and Jada and was like, you two, I need to let you guys know something. So Nasra, I don't know about you so much because people might assume you're from somewhere in Africa or East Africa specifically because of your features, but you and Jada might get a lot of assumptions that you are from this country, or that you are Motswana, which is like the singular person. That's what they're called, Motswana. And so she went on to say, because of that, you may face discrimination. And I was like, what? How? Like, I'm Black, the other person's Black, like, how am I facing discrimination? That threw me off. But basically what she was trying to let us know was that because people assumed we were from there, the first thing that they tended to do a lot of times speak to us in the native language, which was Setswana. And when they did that, I would let them know, hey, I'm learning, but I'm not fluent. I'm like doing my best to learn, and I'm not from here, so I'm still learning. And then they would be taken aback by that. That's when the conversation of where are you from, where are you really from would happen. But sometimes if they didn't ask those follow-up questions of where you were from, they would assume that you were a Motswana who moved to America, and like left their culture and like wasn't interested in learning more about your culture. So from that, they would assume that you think maybe, like they said, that sometimes you would run into people who would think that, oh, you think you're too good to learn more about your own culture or to learn your language and stuff like that. That didn't happen that often, but they let us know that that was still a factor within our, like, us being Black. Like, that's something we needed to pay attention to. So yeah, that was one of the most surprising things that I went through, which did happen a couple of times where people would be like, "Oh, you're not from here? Oh, like why don't you speak the language?" And I would like, explain to them. But yeah, you guys get the point. And then, so before I left the U.S. And went abroad, some things that I prepared for was that I asked advice about how I would be perceived and whether people would look at me and see an American or if they would see something else. So, and then also I asked questions about wearing hijab, and like we talked about like those three things that define you. Mine personally are my religion, my race, and my gender. So I'm a Black Muslim woman. So I asked questions about that specifically, and more so how my hijab would be perceived. And they let me know that would be totally fine. That wasn't something you need to worry about. That more so you might be assumed that you are from here. So that's one thing you need to look out for or pay attention to, or just let people know and understand that. And then outside of that research, once I got there, mostly that's when I started to realize how people perceived me. And it really was actually a conversation starter almost. And Jada was one of the people that always was like, I don't actually have a follow-up answer to where you really from. So that would give people more information about our backgrounds and how there are Blacks outside of Africa that do not necessarily say they're from some other country outside of America or outside of other countries. And then, yeah, the last couple of things is that to wrap it up is advice that I would give for another Black student or African American who's going to be studying abroad in a majority Black African country is to let you know that you will be receiving questions like that, even if it may be your first time receiving those questions, or if, like me personally, who has received those questions in America before, that shouldn't deter you from going there. And also, if you don't want to be that person who has to answer all these questions, you can leave it at that and let people learn on their own. Or it can be a conversation starter where you could be like, hey, I'm actually Black and just Black American, that's it. There's no more. I'm not from Kenya, I'm not from wherever else. And then it may be your first time being in a country or being in an area where you're no longer a majority physically or a minority physically, but there's still aspects in which you can still be considered a minority in terms of like your nationality, in terms of like not understanding the language or like speaking the same language as them. But in the end, the experience is so much more worth it, and what you gain from it and what you take away from it is way more worth it than being nervous about how you will be perceived and how your identity may be taken on. And yeah, if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to contact me personally. I don't know if there are any points that I forgot, but I think I summed up my overall experience in terms of my race and like my identity and how I was perceived while I was out there. And in total, like overall, it was one of the best experiences ever, going to a country where I physically was not a minority anymore. Everyone was Black. So it was like, it wasn't something nervous. Yeah. No problem. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I think you touched on some of the biggest sort of topics about going to a predominantly Black country and why it is so appealing. Being able to, for many of us, the first time, not have to feel like a minority anymore. So fitting in more easily is a big advantage and a big draw, right? You may find if you are Black and going to a predominantly Black country that you have access to different spaces and cultural aspects that a non-Black person may not have access to because they're obviously foreign. But as Nasser showed us, it can also be challenging, right? When you then have that moment where they figure out that you're not actually from there and have some sometimes uncomfortable conversations. I know many students also have this idea of going to Africa because they want to explore a heritage or a culture that they feel a connection to, or they want to feel a connection. And it can be a little bit disappointing if you get there and experience the cultural differences and experience being an outsider. And again, not a reason not to go, but just things to think about as you put together your expectations and decide where you want to go. So thank you again, Nasra. So up next, we will hear from Yuan. If we can go to the next slide, thank you, who studied abroad in Italy, and I will turn it over to him.
Yuan, you might be on mute, so make sure that you get unmuted before you start speaking. See here. Hi, Yuan. Can you hear us?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. My name is Yuan. I am a current Temple University student. My major is public relations, and I'm currently minoring in political science and Italian. Now, I studied abroad this past semester in Rome, Italy, and that is a predominantly white country, if for those that do not know. And the demographics where I studied, so like I said, it was predominantly white, but as time went on, I learned that there is a presence of, there is a Black presence. I don't know if people know, but Europe has experienced a large influx of migrants that are coming in. On top of that, I took a course called Migration, Race, and Immigration in Europe, and I learned about the concept of race there and how it applied. And then on top of that, I worked at a refugee center, which let me see people that look like me. And how did people react to me? When I first got there, I have to say I was very excited. I was very everywhere. I had to see everything that was going on. I wanted to go do this. I wanted to go do that. I signed up for this. I signed up for that. And the first time that I had a reaction that completely shocked me, that made me, it's kind of like, I don't know how to explain it, but I was waiting for an experience that was going to make me aware that I was Black and I was there. And the experience, and that sounds crazy, but like that's what was in the back of my head the entire time I was there. And I was like, okay, when is it going to happen? Enjoy everything, enjoy as much as you can, because you know that there's going to be a moment. And for me, my moment was when I was at the refugee center and I was talking to one of the guys there. And he looked at me and he heard my voice and he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "The United States." And he said, "You can't be from the United States." He said, "The United States is white." He said, "You're from Nigeria. You have to be from Nigeria." And I said, no, I'm from the United States. And it was kind of like a thrown off thing. And he walked away from me and he said, no, he's from Nigeria. The United States is white. But as the weeks went on and as I saw him more frequently, I kind of put my personality onto him. And I kind of wanted him to understand what it was like to be a Black person from America. So I went out of my way every time I was at the refugee center to walk up to him and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" "Oh, I'm doing great." And then we would get into a little conversation. And by the end of that experience, I was able to, I think, form his opinion. And then on top of that, during the first few weeks, I went to Cinque Terre, which is in a northern part of Italy. I had went there and I was on the beach. And while I was on the beach with my friends, I had one of the vendors come up to me and he said, "What part of Africa are you from?" And I said, I'm from the United States. And he wouldn't accept this as an answer. We kind of didn't get into a big back and forth. I kind of just agreed with him and let him go away. But that was definitely something that completely threw me off. So also, Italy has a large Afro-Italian community, which is Italian-born African people that live there. I found this out from my migration course. We had somebody come in. Her name was Benedetta. She's native to Italy. I learned from her experience. I met her later on in my experience, but what I learned from her was what it was like to be Black and actually be there and to live there her entire life, and the system of race that applied to her. I was able to see it through her eyes. And I think that if I had experienced that earlier, I would have probably viewed this completely differently, but it still didn't take away from my experience at all. Also, I did do a little research before I went abroad. Like for me, I know that there was the statistic about 5% of people going abroad being Black, but when I went further into it, I found out that for Black men, it was even lower. So I was like, oh my gosh, now I'm this person that I'm gonna be people's first time. So when I had learned that, I said, how do I make the best of this? How do I make the best of this without thinking too much into what people are gonna perceive me as? Because at the end of the day, I'm just me and I'm just an experience. For instance, Before I went abroad, I Googled statistics. The first thing that I Googled was statistics. And then after statistics, I was able to branch that out into, okay, what will I be safe while I'm abroad? Basically, that was the basis of all of the research that I felt the need to research, because I was very nervous about that. Now, what advice would I have for an African-American students going to study abroad? Okay, for one, in Italy, you're going to be stared at. It is inevitable that you're going to be stared at. A little joke, before I had actually talked to the other students of color while I was there, the first 2 weeks, I thought I was being stared at because I was attractive, because I was wearing all of these nice clothes, and I'm like, okay, maybe it's just a thing where it's based on me being cute. Turned out not to be. I talked to the other students that were there, and they said, no, it's because you don't look like somebody that they've seen before. It's you're kind of the other, the concept of the other. And I after being told this, after going through those experiences again, I had noticed it. And then from that point on, I think it completely changed my experience. But I have to say, we know that race exists. We know that racism, exclusion, we know that these are concepts that go on all around us, and they're there. They're inevitable. They're there. We're trying to make a better world. We're trying to contribute to a better world. But we shouldn't let the idea of them being there stop us from going and having these experiences. Personally, I think that it needs to happen. We need to go abroad, and we need to see things. And that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your experience, and yeah, just thank you. So some takeaways based on what you mentioned about being in a racially, homogenous country, especially one that does not have many Black people, is that something that probably anyone would imagine being a novelty, and receiving a lot of attention. It sounds like a lot of the attention in Yuan's case was somewhat negative. Some people experience positive attention, so maybe you feel like a celebrity. So a big one I have heard is many students, especially males, who go to China, people will think that they are a basketball player. I was just reading a blog by a Black woman who traveled to Poland, and she looks nothing like Serena Williams, but everyone thought she was Serena Williams, so she got all of this free stuff and had an entourage. But of course, even positive attention can get old after a while. Moving on just a little bit to talk about the experience in a mixed society or culture. We don't have a student panelist for this today, but as you can imagine, it has both some of the positives and some of the challenges of each of the scenarios that we discussed. So being in a mixed society or culture, you may find that you're able to blend in more and you are less obviously a foreigner. But even so, you will probably find that others identify you differently than they would back home. So what it means to be Black, say in Brazil, is probably different than what it means to be in your hometown. And your racial identity may not even exist or be recognized in the place where you go. And wherever you go, the racial history, the norms, and the culture are going to be completely different than what you're used to in the US. And finally, if we can go to the next slide, there's some challenges that you're going to face if you are the first in your family or your peer group to go abroad. Hopefully everyone in your life is fully on board and excited for you to undertake the journey of going abroad, but there are a number of reasons why people may be hesitant, right? So cost and value is a big one. Let's be real, study abroad can be pretty expensive, and there may be a misconception that you're not getting enough benefit for what it costs, or that you'll essentially be on vacation. For that reason, it can seem like it's a waste of money, right? And maybe something that distracts from school. That obviously is not the case. Many study abroad programs are very rigorous, can contribute to your academic program, and also there's the learning outside of the classroom. Additionally, parents and other relatives may be worried about your safety, depending on where you're going. Sometimes we also hear that from students that family is not supportive because of the mindset that it's not something that we do, right? Maybe people in your family don't travel outside of their community, and going off to a college was a big enough deal, but going outside of the country is just way out there. And this also feeds into my next point, that there can sometimes be a bit of jealousy or invalidation of the opportunity by people in your life who didn't have access to these opportunities. And in all these cases, you'll want to do your research and share the benefits and other information about why it is that you want to go abroad. Hopefully, the more that they learn about your plans, the more they're willing to support you. And we actually have a section in our Black Student Guide. We'll share that at the end of this program, and other resources on our site specifically designed at how to talk to and talk about study abroad with your parents. And like I said, hopefully your family and friends are on your side, or they eventually come around, but there are many other places that you can turn to for support. Professors, advisors, and other mentors that you have at your school can, of course, help you to talk over your goals and to decide where and when and what you would like to study abroad. Your campus's study abroad office is also a great place to go for specialized knowledge about what programs might meet your goals. You'll also want to identify and investigate resources at your African American or Black Student Center. That way you can get very specialized information and hear from students who have gone abroad or who have done similar things. And your friends, family, things like that. If you are part of your campus's Black Student Union, it's also a good idea to check in with juniors and senior students who may have advice, especially about Black-friendly places and their experiences abroad. And finally, we invite you to connect with us at Diversity Abroad. We have an online forum, events like these, and Trixie will talk at the end about another big event that we have for students. After you've returned from study abroad, and for those of you who have returned from study abroad, you know this firsthand, you will be very excited to share all of your experiences with your friends and family. And for the most part, they will be excited to listen for about 30 minutes, right, at the most. It can be really tricky to balance your desire to share with not seeming like you're bragging or that you're full of yourself. And there's also, I think, honestly, some FOMO for the people who weren't able to go. Hopefully you kept in touch with your close friends and family while you were abroad, so coming back will be a continuation of this conversation. To the extent that your budget and your suitcase allow, you might want to consider when you're abroad bringing home small gifts for people as a way for them to share in the experience with you. And if you'd like to do something on a larger scale, many colleges and universities will have global events or study abroad affairs. And as a return study abroader, you may be able to participate and share your experiences that way. And you can always share with us. That's how we had our 2 student guests today. And we also have a Global Leadership Summit that Trixie is going to tell you a little bit more about.
Thanks, Laurel. So as Laurel mentioned, there are a lot of different ways to try to address perhaps the lack of support or where you can get support for your goals to have global experiences. It can be challenging to find yourself in a position where nobody quite understands what your desire is or how this benefits you professionally and academically. And many of you might be in a position as well where you were the only student of color on your program, or perhaps even a minority just at your institution in general. And you're seeking a place where you can find this communal sense of finding camaraderie with other students who identify similarly to you and are similarly looking for a space and others with whom they can share those stories and share those adventures and aspirations to continue having global experiences where you feel accepted and welcomed. And that's really what the Global Student Leadership Summit is. So I won't spend too much time talking about this. You can see that there is a URL at the bottom of the slide. The Global Student Leadership Summit is essentially a 3-day conference for students who have already been abroad, who would like to find that sense of community with other students. So we bring together students from institutions across the United States. So if you are like Nasra at a small liberal arts school and you are perhaps one of the few students of color on your program, or you could be like Yuan at a bigger institution and still also find yourself in the minority of students represented in your study abroad program, it's great to actually then find community with one another and to lament about some of your frustrations and to vent about some of the microaggressions that you felt or the stereotypes and the perceptions that people placed on you. and to be able to process that. And what does that mean? And that, again, is what the Global Student Leadership Summit achieves and tries to achieve at our conference. And so this year it's being held in Miami. And again, you can read more details on our website. But it's just really an opportune place to find other students globally minded just like you, unpack your experience abroad, draw connections between what you experienced, how it impacts you academically and professionally, and how it sets you up for success for whatever lies ahead. And you'll also get the opportunity to network with professionals who are in that space. And so the student conference essentially happens during our professional conference. So while you might be one of 50 or 70 students in this conference, you'll also be surrounded by about 400 professionals, many of whom have many study abroad or global experiences and can help to navigate you and perhaps introduce you to opportunities you perhaps didn't know about before. So if you're in that position, if you're one of those students who notified us earlier that, yes, you have had study abroad experiences, feel free to check out our website. And I'm also happy to answer questions that you might have about that at the end of this webinar. So yeah, maybe I'll just pause there and we'll jump to questions. I know I've gotten a couple already. So let me just go back to, let me just answer this quick question. Somebody had asked, are there scholarships available for the conference? There were a few travel stipends, but they have been dispersed already. That said, we expect students to attend by getting nominated by their schools. So we ask you to get nominated, not because we would deter students or turn students away even. All students that get nominated are accepted, but we do want students to get their travel and accommodation and registration essentially paid for. And that's what your school or your program provider would be able to do. So I would say talk to those people in your school or at your provider to see about getting nominated. We did also have two earlier questions for our student panelists. So I'm going to invite Nasra and Yuan to feel free to respond. One of the questions that came up, the first question that came up was, did you notice any natural hair care products and such in stores when abroad? Or did you see any spaces for people of color? So I think spaces might be broadly interpreted, but I might ask Yuan and Nasra to kind of answer that question. A, were there hair care products where you were? And B, were there spaces essentially for students of color? So I don't know who would like to speak first, but you're welcome to take the floor for a few minutes.
I can go first.
Sure.
Hello again, I'm Nasra. So for the hair care products, since I was in Southern Africa, yes, there were plenty. Personally, I brought my own beforehand and enough to last me. And this is going to sound really terrible, but I'm not that great at taking care of my hair because I wear hijab most of the time. Nobody really sees my hair. So don't judge me. And then another thing is, since I was in a predominantly Black country and it was Southern Africa, my friend Jada, I think she got her hair done twice while she was out there because it was so cheap. It's like extremely, especially if like you're a person who likes to get braids or yeah, I think braids was like one of the cheapest things, and I haven't done it before, so I didn't really understand the pricing, but Jada explained it to me. She's like, here in the US it costs like upwards to over $100, $200, but over there it was like $30, $40, $50 max if you were trying to do something really extravagant. So it was really cheap for hair specifically. And then the second question about student spaces for either Black students or students of color, my campus was predominantly Black, so everywhere. So everywhere was like a place for students of color. A lot of people like to hang out in the student center. Another place that they like to hang out was, we had dining halls. We had two different dining halls. And one of them, a lot of people like to hang out outside of it because it had benches and tables. Yeah. That, in regards to on campus, yeah, that was it.
Yeah. Yuan, I don't know if you had any advice about hair products, but feel free to unmute and let us know if you had any comments on that. In the meantime, we also had a question for the students as well that says, what kind of support, oh, Yuan wanted to speak. Let me unmute Yuan. Yuan, sorry, Yuan. There you are.
Perfect. No.
Go ahead.
Okay, so on hair care, for me personally, I had to cut off the top of my hair. I had my hair dyed and it was really long, but it had started to knot and I wasn't able to get the things that I needed to take care of it, one of which being a pick. Just a little background, before I had went abroad to Italy, I did the research on YouTube and I was like into this idea of being a minimalist while traveling abroad. I didn't want to be one of those people that had a big suitcase that I had to pay overage for. So I ended up having a suitcase that was only 35 pounds. Turned out to be a very big mistake because I ended up buying a lot of stuff while I was there and having to get a whole nother suitcase. But one thing that I didn't pack was a lot of hair products because I was very confident that I could find what I needed on Amazon, or I would be able to find resources out of nothing. It turned out to not work out that way. But as time went on, as I started talking to more people, I found out that they're over by Termini, which Termini is the main train station in Rome. Over there, there is like an African quarter where there's a whole bunch of hair salons, there's barbers, there's all this stuff that I found out after I chopped off my beautiful, luxurious hair. And on the other topic of spots that students could hang out at, I found out from one of my professors that there were places out here. There were places there. Wi-Fi is actually almost everywhere, and you can go to any cafe and get Wi-Fi and do work. I happen to live in an area where there was a cafe right downstairs, and I could sit there and do work because they had Wi-Fi. And that's it.
Thanks, Yuan.
Of course.
So we had another question for the students. What kind of support, if any, did you receive from the study abroad institution? So your schools, I suppose, Temple, Kenyon, as well as University of Botswana, and I don't recall Yuan the name of the school that you were at in Italy. But what would have helped you with your experience studying abroad as a Black student?
So within my home college, so through Kenyon, we have the Center for Global Engagement. They help us like basically up until with the application process and like helping you understand where you're going and like what you need to research beforehand. But in terms of once I actually arrived there, the program director of my program happened to be a professor from my school. So it was Professor Voles, who was a Kenyon College professor. So he was our direct contact, but we also had this other woman named Emily Gall, who was our contact for the program. So I was in a program called ACM, Associated Colleges of the Midwest. She was who we would go to for questions before we left about both Professor Voles and Emily were very helpful with questions of like what to pack, what we should be wearing while we're out there, whether like it was a more conservative country or if it wasn't. And like Professor Voles has been going back there for like 20 years. He did Peace Corps there after he finished his undergrad and has been going back for like 20 years. So he had a lot of background knowledge on Botswana and the country and the people. So he was very resourceful in that sense. But also he is a white man. So I didn't know if I could ask him all the questions I needed to ask him. And he was very helpful. But sometimes I felt like he wouldn't understand the perspective that I'm coming from, being like Muslim and Black and a woman. So sometimes those things I went to Emily for, specifically for about women questions and walking around and like feeling safety concerns. And then the other woman who was actually there with us, her name was Mary. We would ask her questions and more specific in regards to like gender. But most of the time, I had a roommate, so I lived in the dorms, and I had a roommate who was a local. I went to her for everything else. She was very helpful. She would explain to me any questions that I had. And I did have a similar problem in the beginning where people would stare a lot, and I was like, I thought I blended in. What could people be staring at? And so she like explained it to me. She's like, you're new, like people can pick that out, and like also you're walking in a group of a bunch of white kids, so they're gonna stare at all of you guys. And I was like, okay, makes sense now. So yeah. I had a roommate, so I used, but your best resource is going to be locals. I'm telling you, like, you might have to go out of your comfort zone and like have to reach out to people and be the person who has to introduce themselves first, which I'm not that kind of person, but I had to learn to become that person so that I could be more comfortable and get the most out of my experience. And that was all.
And for me, if I could interject, for me, I use the university. I know I didn't say it earlier, but Temple has a university in Rome. So it was Temple University Rome that I had actually studied abroad at. And we had a student affairs director. Her name is Francesca Cuccovillo. And I think from the very beginning, she made it very clear that she was a resource for us and somebody that we can go to when we had these troubles, when we had these problems, which I definitely did go to her. And she was definitely a voice of support. And now outside of university, there was on one hand, I could count on one hand the people of color that were actually abroad and were able to see the experience of being abroad and being a person of color. When it came to having them as a resource, I think it was very eye-opening for me to see, because I see the world the way I see the world based on the way I was raised. But to hear from them and to compare what's happening here versus what's happening there, and to also say the things that I was concerned about and to hear the things they were concerned about and to give my best advice, I think that contributed the most to me having a good experience and me being able to take the good out of the negative and the positive out of all the things that did happen to me.
Thanks, Yuan. So I understand that we are at time, but I did want to squeeze in one more question. For those of you who are unable to stick around, that's totally fine. You will get, as I said, a copy of this recorded webinar as well as a copy of the slides. So thank you to those of you who have to leave. So there are a couple more questions I just want to squeeze in here. There was a question that says, is it encouraged for non-traditional students with young children to study abroad? Are the children even allowed to go? That question is better suited, I think, for either the school that you're attending or the program through which you want to go abroad. There isn't one consistent rule, and I would suspect for non-traditional students who have families, I think many students choose to do a shorter term 1 week to 2 week program to get the experience, but then that way they won't have to be away from their children for too long. Alternatively, you could look into whether or not housing options are available, but I can't guarantee that that would be the case, especially in particular if students are expected to do a homestay or stay in a student dorm for something like that. So I think that might be a better question suited, again, for either a provider or for the school through which you're going abroad. Another student asked, what could I expect studying abroad in Russia? I'm not sure if any one of our panelists has been to Russia or can speak to that cultural cultural environment. I will wait to see if anyone has. But also for those who might be interested, we do have destination guides on diversityabroad.com. So if you go to www.diversityabroad.com/destinations, you might be able to find information there, which could be helpful. Another question, did you find that a lot of the stereotypes that exist in the US reproduced in European countries? If so, do you feel that you constantly had to prove your worth in the program? That might be a good question for Yuan. So I'm going to ask it again just so you can hear it. Did you find that a lot of the stereotypes that exist in the US, specifically negative tropes, reproduced in European countries? And if so, did you feel that you have to constantly prove your worth in the program?
Okay. For me, the only thing that I think that really stood out was the presumption of the presumption that I was from Africa. Like, for instance, I would go into a store and I like to challenge myself. I like to speak Italian with the people and with the vendors at the store, but it was always assumed that the only language I spoke was English. So people would immediately speak English to me. And I think that it was annoying in a sense because I saw how my friends, they could go in, they could speak Italian, they could already interject and have these conversations, whereas I had to tell you that I had a desire for it. But in terms of Europe can you repeat the second half of that question?
Sure. She asked, if so, did you feel that you had to constantly prove your worth in the program?
Constantly proving my worth. I definitely do think I had to do that, but when it came to putting forward the effort, I think that the result and the way I was treated when I showed effort, when I wanted to show that I cared for the language, that I cared for learning the culture, the way that I was treated was completely different. I was teaching a woman English while I was there. She introduced me to all of her friends, and I got to learn that part of the culture, and they got to see my American side as a result of it. But
okay, thanks, Yuan. Okay, last question, because I know we have a couple of questions. So for the sake of time, what I'll do is for those of you who are asking your final questions, I'll make a note of your name and your question, and I'll pass them along to our presenters, who will then be able to follow up with you via email, if that's all right. I just want to make sure that everyone is able to, we want to be mindful of the time crunch that we are dealing with the webinar. But these are great questions, and I really, really appreciate them coming in, and we'll make sure that you get your questions answered, if that's okay. So I just want to go ahead and move forward with closing out our webinar. As I said, as your questions continue to come in, we'll certainly make sure to pass those along and make sure that those of you who are asking, we have your contact information, so you will get an email from us. But let's just close out the webinar with our final slides. We have here a few resources for you to view. As Laurel mentioned previously, we did create a Black Students Guide to Global Programs. It is available for purchase, and I'll make sure that when you get this resource, you'll be able to click on the link and see if you're interested in a single copy, which is about $7. We also have a slew of great resources. All of these other articles are available on diversityabroad.com. So you're welcome to click on those as well and read a couple of firsthand narratives and articles contributed by other students who've already been in experiences abroad. So similar to students like Yuan and Nasra, they have been abroad and have a lot of resources and things that they can share with you based on their experiences. So certainly you'll get a copy of that as well after we wrap up. Finally, make sure you follow us online. We are on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. We do have a Snapchat, but it's not very active, and Vimeo. But we'll make sure to share this webinar with you as well on YouTube. So just expect a copy of that. And feel free to join us at diversityabroad.com. It's totally free. This is Laurel's contact information and my contact information as well. So if you continue to have questions, we'll make sure to answer them and get back to you. And again, we did catch a couple of those final questions that came in, so you will get your questions answered. We'll just follow up with you via email. I hope that's okay. So with that, I know we're way over time now, but I just want to say thank you again to our panelists, to Yuan and to Nasra for joining us, and to my co-presenter Laurel for putting together a great presentation. On behalf of everybody, thank you for tuning in. And again, we'll make sure to send you this recording and the slides so you can make sure to go through all of the resources that we've shared from today's presentation. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Happy Black History Month. And we hope to see you either in Miami or online in our communities online. Take care, everyone.